So what we're going to have a look at in this video is something that students are quite often asked to do as part of ICT coursework or exam tasks, and that's to create a sort of navigation menu system. So the first thing we need to think about is the structure. How's that actually going to be made? So I'm going to make this using divs, and if you haven't used a div before, you might want to go back and have a look at the previous video. So I'm just going to drag one on. So what I'm going to have is a div, a box for basically the whole of the menu. And then inside that, I'm going to have one for each of the separate drop-down sections. So I'm going to drag another one inside there. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go up here. I'm going to type some things in there. So just so we can see where it is to begin with. Obviously, the items you'll have in your menu might be different. So I'm just going to call it menus. That's what it's going to say at the top. And then underneath that, I'm going to have my links. So I might have link 1, link 2, link 3. That's what it says. Link obviously says 3. So what I need to do then is I need to structure these, because if I put those in there, it's obviously just a big list of text. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this a paragraph. And the reason I'm going to make it a paragraph is because it's a little bit easier to tweak the sizing, so spacing, margins, etc. And then obviously these things here are going to be links. Now you could put these in divs themselves, each of the links, but actually because they're going to be hyperlinks, and a hyperlink is a kind of element by itself, we can just style the hyperlink into a box or whatever we want it to look like. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make those links. I'm going to use this. Now what you might want to think about in your menu structure, and in fact throughout your site generally, is how you want links to appear. So in my own website, for example, links to other pages open in the same browser window or tab, and links to external sites appear in new tabs or new windows, depending on your browser settings, just to make it easier for people to find their way back to my site when they've finished looking at the other thing. So you've got two things. You've got the actual address, and then you've got a thing called the target frame. So just for ease of typing, and it's a nice short address, I'm going to have my links go to, well actually I could use my own website, which I'm going to, as that's in the seems to be in the history. Okay, so I'm going to pick that as one of my links, and I'm going to go to target frame, and I'm going to say open that in a new window. And in fact, I'm going to set that as the page default. Okay, so that's my first link. And then my second link, I'll have the BBC again, because that's nice and short. And then my third link, I'll have to maybe YouTube or something. So YouTube. So notice if I start an address that it recognizes, it puts the HTTP bit in there, but you do need the full address, including the HTTP part, unless it's on the same site, in which case you can start after the domain name, so after the first slash. Okay, so I've got 3 links in. I haven't styled it. It doesn't look much like a menu at the moment. So let's just have a look at that, see what that's going to look like in the browser so far. So yeah, the links should work. Yeah, there we go. But it obviously doesn't look much like a menu. So what we need to do is we need to start applying some style to that with CSS. But before we do that, we need to tell the browser obviously how to which bits to pick out and which bits to style, because we've used several divs. So what I'm going to do is, this is where I'm going to use the IDs and classes that I've talked about previously. Now because the menu bar, the whole thing across the top, there's only going to be one of those, I can use the ID. So remember, the difference between IDs and classes is that IDs need to be unique, so there can only be one of each one. So I could use a class for this, but because there's only one, I'll go with convention and use ID. So I'm going to call that menu bar. So it doesn't matter what I call it. And then because I'm going to have possibly multiple menus, what we do is we get one right first, and then we'll copy and paste it. I'm going to use class for this because there's going to be more than one. So I'm going to call this menu. And And then each item in there, I'm going to also, because again there's multiple items, I'm going to call that, let's just call it menu item. And again, I'm using class because there's going to be multiple ones of those, so menu item. And then I'm going to apply that. Actually, I don't need to do that because I'll show you another way to do that, which makes your page a bit shorter and saves you adding all those classes. So we'll come back to and do that in a minute. So first thing I need to do is I'm going to say where the menu bar is going to go. So I could use the style over here. So I'm going to go to New Style, which takes a while to open on my PC for some reason. There we go. And I'm going to put in my, if I'd have selected it first, it would have put it in here for me, but I'm going to put in my selector, which is menu bar. Remember, things we've named with an ID, we use a hash at the start of the style. And so what am I going to do? Well, let's have a font. So I'm going to have all my menu structure in Arial, say. And then, well, it'll be black by default, so just let's leave it black to remove the kind of clutter from the CSS. In terms of blocks, we will leave that. So background, I want it to stand out from the page. So mine's going to be quite a dull looking menu, but obviously you can think a bit more about styling and colors, etc. So I'm just going to pick grey for the background. And then what else? I'm not going to put any borders on or anything, but what I will do is I will give it a height. So in the position section, I'm going to give it a height. So let's say, I think probably 30 pixels is about enough. But again, you could make that percentage or use VH, VW, size it relatively. And this is the important bit. I'm going to use absolute positioning because I want it to be right at the top of the page. And I want it to, always be there. So I'm going to position it. And again, if you're not familiar with positioning, then have a look at the previous video on divs and positioning. So I'm going to position it against the left margin, against the right margin, and against the top. So having it against the left margin and the right margin, so having both left and right being 0, has the effect of giving it a width that's the full width of the screen. So I don't need to specify the width as well. So let's have a look at what that looks like. Okay, so we've now got my grey bar across the top, and what we're going to say about the menu. So now currently, so we could make the menu, the drop down bit, grey as well. So what did we call that? We called it menu. So we could style menu. So this is a class, remember. So new style. So menus, styles, classes begin with a dot, a full stop. So I might also want to make this grey as well, so when it drops down over the page you can see that it's got a background. So I don't need to select the font because the menu is inside the menu bar. The font from the menu bar will cascade down, but background colours don't cascade, so I need to choose a background colour. So I'll just make it the same. And what I might want to do, actually, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. This is something that I quite often do, is I'm going to just put a border around it, just so I can see where it is. So I'm going to say solid, thin, red border, say, just so I can see where that drop-down menu is to begin with. So let's say OK, because we can see by default that menu is actually the full width. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to give that a width. Now I'm going to just do it up here. So I'm going to say width, and I think maybe 75 pixels might be enough. So because I've been doing this a while, I get a feel for how wide things should be, but you can do it by trial and error. And this is where using the code view comes in, because it's very easy to quickly just tweak the numbers till it looks right. Okay, so now we can see that's possibly the right width. Other things that we might want to do, we can put our text alignment in there. So we can say text text align. Let's center the text within the menu. Now what we notice here is that the items, and if we go and have a look in the browser as well, see it's the same. The items, actually here, they're aligned better, aren't they? But what you might want to do is, because links are inline items, so naturally if the box was wide enough they would appear next to each other, what we might want to make them is block items, so each one starts on a new line. So I was about to give those a class, but actually we don't need to, because one of the things I haven't covered in CSS is this. So I can style those links like this, because a link uses A. A is the tag for a link, so if you click on one there, you can see, there we go, there's the tag. So if we use this in our CSS section, so if we say dot menu A, what that means is apply this style to all all links within a menu. So we can have, so we're not styling all links on the page, we're just styling the ones that are inside a menu. And that means we don't have to worry about all of our links. We've got links further out on the main part of the page, them looking like this as well. So what we're going to go for there is, let's just make those display, and let's go for inline block. So inline block is probably better than block if you want to size things, give them margins, paddings, etc. So you can see that they now appear, each link will start on a new line, basically. Now it's a block. And other things we might want to do with links that are within the menu is you might want to change the color. So you might want to not have them blue and not have them change color when they've been visited, which will be the default behavior of the browser. So let's just call them, let's just make them black. And underlining, strangely, is not called a style or anything, it's called a decoration. So text decoration. If we want to turn off something, you select the decoration to be none. So now they're still links, they still work, but they're not blue and they're not underlined. So let's have a look what that looks like. So we're getting there with a kind of layout now. However, that isn't a menu, is it? It doesn't drop down, it doesn't move. But we can, so I can take the border off now. I can see kind of where it is. So let's just, and that'll make our code a bit shorter. So there. Let's delete that. Now, probably what I would want to do is, if we go back to the browser and just have a look at that, is the menu is it's not lined up very well with the menu bar, the word menu. So let's do a little bit of work on that and see if we can kind of center it vertically within the bar and maybe make it bold or something. So I put the menu in a paragraph. Now the reason I put it in a paragraph is I could have just had the text without any kind of paragraph, but it'd be more difficult to put margins and padding on it. So I've put it in a paragraph. But just like here, it's a paragraph inside a menu. So rather than styling all paragraphs, I can do this. I can say only style paragraphs inside a menu like this. So I'm going to say font weight. So I'm going to make it bold. Font weight bold. And what else might I want to do? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, because it was a bit too far down. Now the reason it was a bit far too down is possibly because there's a default margin on there. And if there's a default margin, you can override that by putting margin 0. Now if you want to get rid of something, you don't need units, because 0% and 0 pixels effectively the same. So you can just use 0. So let's see what that looks like. Now see, now that's gone too far up. So so obviously there was quite a large default margin on there. So what we might want to do is just pop a little bit on there. So let's try 5. Let's see what that looks like. There you go, that's roughly in the middle. You could spend a bit more time tweaking that. So but it's still there, and you could do a similar thing with your links. So you could specify a height for those, for example. So 15 pixels. That's not very much, is it? Maybe 25 pixels. And so you could spread your links out a little bit. Now, what we might actually struggle with here is just the top of that top link just appearing over on the bottom of the menu bar there. So let's just make that maybe slightly more. And what we could do is we could add a little bit of padding in here as well. So if we say padding top, just at the top. So padding, remember, is on the inside of the element. So just a little bit of padding. See what effect that has. There you go. So now the top link is definitely below the bottom of the navigation bar. So this is where the clever bit comes in. So we've got these two divs, and what we want to do is we're going to shrink the menu div, which is the one that contains the links, so it's only the same height as the navigation bar. So the navigation bar, the menu bar, we said was 30 pixels. So what we're going to do with our menu is also make it 30 pixels tall. So if you're not confident typing these in, don't forget you can use the styles on the right hand side and go modify the style. So if you click on an item, you can see the styles. Click on the link, click on the arrow, choose modify, but I'm just going to do it up here. And obviously if you're not using Expression Web, you want to do it this way as well. So what we're going to do is adjust the height of the menu so it's the same height as the background bar. So I'm going to say height, and I'm going to make it 30 pixels. Okay, so I know this isn't going to work, but let's just have a look. Now the problem with that is that it's firstly, because I've used a bit of padding, it's not quite, it's made it a little bit taller. So I'm going to need to shrink that down a little bit more. So I'm going to say height maybe 26, something like that. So there's a lot of trial and error, and so a little bit less. So 5. That's a little bit more still, so 24. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get it so that the grey area doesn't extend below the bottom. So you might see there's a little row kind of 1 pixel high there. So there we go. So now that menu, the visible background on the menu doesn't extend below the bottom of the menu bar. So that's okay. However, I can still see the menu items. So there's one more property which I need to tweak, which is this one. So I need to say what happens when there's too much information to fit in the div. So I mentioned this in a previous video, but we didn't actually use it. So I'm going to say overflow. So overflow means what do you want to do with the stuff that's too big to fit in the div, and I'm going to hide it. So if we go back to the page now, we can see that we can't see any of those links. So how are we going to reveal those links when you move the mouse pointer over there? So if you remember the last video, we used the hover selector. So what I'm going to say is, I'm going to add it in. I'm going to add it in next to the other one. It doesn't really matter when we put it in there. So I'm going to say, what happens when we move? No, it's not there. It's not there, is it? It's when we move the mouse over the menu. So when we move the mouse over the menu, so that would be dot menu hover. What do we want to do? Well, we just want to change the height so it's big enough to show all of those menu items. Now we could work out the height, but actually there's a handy property called auto. So I'm just going to make the height auto, and what auto does is means make it big enough to fit everything that's in there. So now, if we have a look at that, we've got our menu. It just says menu. When we move the mouse pointer over it, the items appear, and when I move the mouse off, they disappear. Now, at the moment, they don't do anything. The cursor changes into a finger to show that that they are links. You might want to do something with them. You might want to have a hover effect on those as well, just so you get a bit of interactivity. So what I'm going to do is, you could do all sorts of things. You can change the background color, but what I'm going to do is I'll just go for fonts. I'll just make them bold. But I could make them go red or do anything else. So I'm going to do that when we hover over an A tag, a link, within the menu. So you might be thinking this looks a little complex, but the idea is basically quite simple. We've got a box with the menu items in it, and when the mouse isn't over it, it's only as tall as the menu bar, and when the mouse is over it, it's big enough to show all of the contents. And as you can see, they now become bold as I move the mouse pointer over them. So that's basically the idea behind the menu. Is just using the hover selector to make the boxes change size. It doesn't matter which way around. So I've done this menu across the top, so they drop down, and my own website is a bit like that. I've just used a different styling, so I've used a semi-transparent black background with rounded corners, but you can style your menu div in this case. What I've also done is I've made my website responsive, because the original design looked like that, and then I realized people were using tablets and things. So a responsive design, it's a similar idea to a hover, where you say this element looks like this without the mouse over it, and it looks like that when you do hover the mouse over it. A responsive design is basically the same, but you can check the size of the page. So I'm going to say, so what my page does is it says, if the page is wide enough, show the menu like this, otherwise show it like that. And in fact, I've actually done 3 different styles. So if you make it narrower still, so on a phone, for example, it's just got 2 sections. So what I've done here is I've got a menu down the side, which opens up horizontally. It's basically the same technique. I'll put some pictures into my links, but that's not too tricky. The only difference between this and the menu that comes down is that I've just adjusted the width of the divs rather than the height. Now you might notice they kind of slide out. I've just used the transition property, which we looked at in the previous video, to make them kind of slide out. So I've done a transition width. I think it takes half a second. One word about that: if you apply transition to animate the change, it doesn't seem to work very well if you use auto for your height, or in this case the width. So what I had to do is actually I had to specify a width for each of these rather than using auto. So I've created one item now, and just as with everything else in ICT or computing, if I want more than one menu, I can just copy and paste. So if I look at my code, we can see the structure is quite simple. We've got one section with the menu bar. Within that, we've got the menu, and within that, we've got the menu items. So this section here is effectively a menu. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that, in fact, I'll change the name of that to menu 1, and then I'm going to copy that section. Now I'm copying it in the code because I think it's a little bit easier to get exactly the bit you want, but you could copy and paste it in the design view at the bottom if you're using Expression Web. So I'm going to have 3 menus. I'm going to call that one menu 2 and menu 3. And then I'm just going to have different amounts of things in there. So now we've created the structure. Actually, we see it's quite flexible, and a bit of copying and pasting will sort it out. So we have a look like what this is doing. Okay, so we can see that it's sort of working, except the layout isn't quite right. So what I'm going to do is, the reason that's happening is because the menu items are appearing beneath each other. So what I need to do with those is if I just make those inline blocks. So see what that does. Okay, so that's better. But now it's doing a slightly different thing. And the different thing it's doing here is because the default layout, and you might have noticed this in Word as well. So in Word, the default, when you insert a picture, is to insert it in line. So it inserts a picture like it's a word, so it might appear in the middle of a sentence. But also the text, when you do that, the text is aligned with the bottom of the picture, isn't it? And effectively, this is doing the same. So all we need to do is change the vertical alignment on the menu so that the divs are aligned at the top rather than at the bottom. So at the moment what this is doing is it's aligning the bottom of the divs so that when they stretch they're still aligned at the bottom. All we need to do is change the vertical alignment property. So vertical alignment and top is what we want. Now vertical alignment does take a bit of getting used to, because at first sight you might think that it will align things vertically within a box, say, which is what we did with the div video using the flex box, because previously it's been quite difficult to align things vertically. That's not what it does. What it does, vertical alignment, it's how two elements appear when they're next to each other. So it's whether you align the tops, whether you align the bottoms. Middle is a little bit hit and miss, but certainly top and bottom are quite safe. So let's save that and see what impact that's had on a menu. There you go. So now they're always aligned across the top. We don't have that same issue, and they all work. And if I choose an item down there, it should load in another page because that's what I've selected. But you wouldn't have to. You can link to separate pages within the same site. Now, obviously, if you made a whole site, then what you'd want to do is you'd want to have this menu on every page. Now, rather than copying and pasting the menu code onto every page, which you could do if you're doing a small site, if you're looking at a big site, and what I do, I've got the same menu on every page. So if I pick a different page, the layout is the same. Then what I've done is used a thing called a server-side include. So I've got the menu structure in a separate file, and then at the top of each page I just say kind of include that file. So that might be something to look into. There are various ways to do that depending on what server you're using. So you do it in a different way on a Windows server using IIS from if you're using, say, Apache on a Linux server. So look into server-side include if you want to include that file without having to copy and paste the code. But that's basically how I would create a drop-down menu system. So a series of divs, a big one for the whole bar across the top, and then a separate one for each drop-down menu. And all we're doing is we're reducing the height to one item and hiding the overflow. And then when we move the mouse pointer over it, we're using hover to make it the full height and show all of the contents.